Welcome to Nikki's Nightmares, where chilling tales come to life. In today's terrifying story, we step beyond the rusted gates of some of the most haunted prisons in America, places where violence, isolation, and death left something behind. From the shadow-filled corridors of Alcatraz Federal Penitentiary to the decaying cells of Eastern State Penitentiary, and the bloodstained halls of West Virginia State Penitentiary, these prisons hold terrifying stories of restless spirits, unexplained whispers, shadow figures, and entities that many believe still roam the darkness long after the inmates are gone. The screams may have faded, but the evil never truly left. If you love scary stories, paranormal encounters, haunted locations, and true horror experiences, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and join me as we delve into the deep, dark, and the mysterious. The screams beneath Alcatraz. Alcatraz Island sits alone in the freezing waters of San Francisco Bay, just over a mile from the city. But it may as well have existed in another world entirely. People called it the Rock, others called it Alcatraz. For nearly 30 years, Alcatraz served as the most feared federal prison in America. It was where the government sent the criminals no other prison could control. Murderers, escape artists, gangsters, men like Al Capone, George Machine Gun Kelly, and countless others passed through its iron gates, knowing one thing for certain. Very few people left Alcatraz unchanged. The prison itself was brutal by design. The original military prison had stood on the island since the 1800s, but in 1933 it was transformed into a maximum security federal penitentiary built specifically to break the spirit of its inmates. Prisoners were given only the bare minimum: food, clothing, shelter, and medical care. Everything else had to be earned, and for many men trapped inside those cold concrete walls, hope disappeared quickly. The cells were tiny, barely large enough for a bed, sink, and toilet. Yet every inmate could see San Francisco glowing in the distance across the bay. They could hear boats, music, laughter drifting through the fog. Everyday life continued just out of reach while they remained buried inside steel and concrete. For some prisoners, that became its own form of torture. The worst punishments took place in Cell Block D, the section guards referred to as the treatment unit. Deep inside that block were cells known simply as the Hole. Prisoners sent there were stripped of nearly everything: no light, no mattress, no human contact. Sometimes only a hole in the floor served as a toilet. Men were left alone in complete darkness for days at a time, and according to both inmates and guards, something else lived down there. One story from the 1940s still lingers over Alcatraz to this day. A prisoner had been locked inside one of the isolation cells overnight. Not long after the door slammed shut, guards reportedly heard him screaming uncontrollably. He begged to be released, claiming a creature with glowing eyes was standing inside the darkness with him. The guards ignored him at first, believing it was another desperate attempt to escape punishment, but the screaming continued for hours. Then suddenly, it stopped. The next morning, guards entered the cell and found the prisoner dead. Reports claimed there were marks around his neck consistent with strangulation. An autopsy later concluded the injuries could not have been self-inflicted. Nobody ever explained what happened inside that cell. Even today, visitors and staff claim Cell 14D feels unnaturally cold compared to the rest of the prison. Some describe overwhelming dread the moment they step near it. Others claim they hear whispers, distant crying, or footsteps moving through empty corridors long after the tours have ended. But cell block D isn't the only place where the dead refuse to stay silent. In 1946, Alcatraz became the site of one of the bloodiest prison escape attempts in American history. Several inmates launched a violent takeover that left guards and prisoners dead before the escape was finally stopped. Since then, visitors and park employees alike have reported hearing screams echoing through the halls late at night, along with the sound of metal doors slamming shut on their own. Others claim to hear chains dragging slowly across the floor. One of the strangest hauntings connected to Alcatraz centers around Al Capone himself. Capone arrived at Alcatraz in 1934 after years of manipulating guards and staff at other prisons. But on the Rock, his power meant nothing. He was treated like every other inmate. During his time there, Capone often played a banjo to pass the endless hours inside his cell. Decades after his death, visitors and staff have reported hearing faint banjo music drifting through cell block B. The music sometimes echoes near cell 181, Capone's former cell, and according to witnesses, the sound usually stops the moment someone tries to follow it. Even the former warden's house carries its own terrifying history. During a holiday gathering in the 1940s, guests reportedly saw the figure of a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing standing silently inside the room. Moments later, the figure vanished, and the fire inside the fireplace suddenly went out. Cold air swept through the house immediately afterward. No doors had opened. No windows were broken, just silence. Today, millions of people visit Alcatraz every year, and many leave with stories they struggle to explain. Tourists describe shadow figures standing inside empty cells. Some claim they've photographed faces that weren't visible at the time. Others hear coughing, sobbing, or whispered voices in areas where nobody else is present. Even children visiting the prison have reportedly pointed toward empty cells and asked their parents about the sad men inside the cages. Perhaps the most unsettling part about Alcatraz isn't the violence or the isolation or even the deaths that occurred there. It's the feeling people describe the moment they step onto the island, an overwhelming heaviness, as though the suffering never truly left, because places like Alcatraz don't simply fade into history. Some places hold onto the pain, and sometimes that pain still walks the halls after dark. The Ghosts of Moundsville. The town of Moundsville, West Virginia, looks quiet from a distance. Small streets, old homes, rolling hills wrapped in fog during the colder months. But looming above the town is something that feels completely out of place. A massive Gothic fortress of stone and iron that seems less like a prison and more like a castle built for suffering. The West Virginia State Penitentiary opened its gates in 1876. And for nearly 120 years, the screams inside those walls never truly stopped. Built on the edge of Moundsville in 1866 and officially opened a decade later, the penitentiary quickly earned a reputation as one of the most brutal prisons in America. The towering Gothic architecture was designed to intimidate. Narrow corridors twisted endlessly through the structure like veins inside a dying body. Iron bars lined every hallway. Massive stone walls blocked out sunlight. Even during the day, the prison felt buried in darkness. Over the decades, thousands of inmates passed through those gates. Many of them never came back out. Violence became part of everyday life inside the prison. Murders between inmates were common. Guards were known for brutal punishment methods that pushed prisoners beyond their limits. Solitary confinement cells known as the Hole became infamous for driving inmates into complete psychological collapse. Men were locked away in freezing darkness for days, sometimes weeks, surrounded by silence so oppressive it felt alive. And then there was the execution chamber. The prison's electric chair, known as Old Sparky, claimed countless lives over the years. One of the most horrifying days in the prison's history came on January 17, 1936, a day inmates would later refer to as Black Friday. 7 men were executed in a single day. Witnesses described the smell of burning flesh lingering in the chamber long after the executions were over. Some guards later claimed they refused to walk near the room at night because they could still hear movement inside, even when the building was empty. But death inside the penitentiary wasn't limited to executions. Overcrowding became a nightmare by the 1980s. The prison was designed for roughly 1,000 inmates, yet more than 2,000 men were packed into its crumbling halls. Riots broke out, assaults became constant, desperation consumed the prison from the inside out. Then came New Year's Day, 1986. One of the largest prison riots in American history erupted inside the penitentiary. More than 1,000 inmates became involved as chaos spread through the cell blocks. Violence consumed the prison for hours while terrified guards and staff struggled to regain control. Many believe something changed in the building after that, not just emotionally, spiritually. The prison finally closed in 1995 due to unsafe and inhumane conditions. But according to countless visitors, former guards, paranormal investigators, and tourists, the penitentiary never truly became empty, because whatever remained inside those walls stayed there. People visiting North Hall, where the most violent inmates were once housed, describe sudden panic attacks for no reason at all. Some report hearing footsteps echoing through empty corridors late at night. Slow, deliberate footsteps that stop the moment you turn around. Others claim to hear whispering coming from locked cells, voices that sound angry, desperate, sometimes begging for help. Former guards who worked at the prison reported seeing dark figures standing motionless behind cell doors after lockdown hours. One guard claimed he repeatedly heard heavy boots walking the upper tiers during overnight shifts, only to discover entire sections completely empty. Paranormal investigators who entered the prison brought EMF meters, EVP recorders, and thermal cameras, hoping to capture evidence of hauntings. Many believe they succeeded. One investigation reportedly captured a voice whispering the words, "Help me," after investigators asked whether any spirits remained trapped inside the prison. Others documented unexplained cold spots, shadow figures, and sudden equipment failures near the execution chamber and solitary confinement area. But among all the stories connected to Moundsville, a few entities are mentioned more than any others. The first is known simply as the Shadow Man. Witnesses describe him as impossibly tall, a black silhouette standing silently at the ends of hallways or between prison bars. Some say his eyes glow faintly in the darkness. Others claim they felt icy breath against the back of their neck moments before seeing him vanish into solid walls. Then there is the Lady in White, a ghostly woman seen wandering the prison corridors late at night, wearing a pale gown stained by shadows. Some believe she was a grieving mother imprisoned after being accused of murdering her own child before dying mysteriously behind prison walls. Visitors claim they've heard soft crying echoing through empty hallways moments before seeing her standing near the windows, staring out into the darkness beyond the prison. And perhaps the most disturbing figure of all, the Faceless Man. A spirit believed to be the victim of a brutal inmate beating decades ago. Witnesses describe seeing a pale human figure watching silently from dark corners. But where a face should be, there is nothing. No eyes, no mouth, just smooth, empty flesh. Some visitors have fled the prison entirely after encountering him. Others refuse to speak about what they saw at all. Today, the West Virginia State Penitentiary stands abandoned, but not silent. The iron doors still groan in the darkness. The execution chamber still waits beneath flickering lights. And deep inside the prison's cold stone corridors, many believe the dead are still walking. Some places remember suffering, and sometimes they refuse to let it go. The evil inside Eastern State. Founded in 1829, Eastern State Penitentiary was never meant to be an ordinary prison. It was designed as an experiment, a place where silence, suffering, and total isolation were supposed to force criminals into repentance. But behind its towering stone walls and iron gates, something far darker took root. And according to countless visitors, investigators, and former workers, some of it never left. For nearly a century and a half, Eastern State Penitentiary stood as one of the most feared prisons in America. The prison was built around the Quaker belief that solitude could cleanse the soul. Prisoners were locked away in small cells for almost every hour of the day. They were forbidden from speaking, forbidden from seeing one another. Even their identities were stripped away and replaced with numbers. When inmates were moved through the prison halls, black hoods were pulled over their heads so they could never look upon another human face. Inside their cramped cells, they sat in silence for days, months, sometimes years. The only sounds were distant footsteps echoing through cold corridors and the creaking of rusted iron doors somewhere deep within the prison. The system was supposed to inspire reflection and redemption. Instead, it drove many prisoners into madness. Even the legendary author Charles Dickens visited the prison during its height and was horrified by what he witnessed. Dickens described the isolation and punishments as cruel beyond words, believing the psychological torture inflicted there was among the worst forms of suffering imaginable. And the punishments inside Eastern State were truly nightmarish. Those who broke the rules were dragged into places far worse than their already miserable cells. Some prisoners were subjected to what guards called the water bath. They were drenched in freezing water during the dead of winter and chained outside until ice began forming on their skin. Others were taken to a punishment chamber known simply as the Hole. Deep beneath cell block 14, these underground concrete cells were completely lightless. No windows, no plumbing, no human contact. Prisoners could spend weeks or months buried alive in darkness beneath the prison. And perhaps worst of all was the iron gag. The prisoners' hands would be tied behind their back while an iron device clamped onto their tongue. Any movement pulled violently against the flesh, tearing it apart. Some inmates bled so badly they nearly suffocated. Then there was the mad chair. Prisoners were strapped so tightly into the restraint device that circulation would eventually stop. Limbs turned dark blue. Some inmates reportedly suffered permanent damage, while others never fully recovered mentally from the ordeal. The prison became a breeding ground for despair. Suicides became increasingly common. Many inmates lost their grip on reality entirely, and over time people began to wonder if that suffering had left something behind. Even one of the prison's most infamous inmates believed the place was haunted. In 1929, notorious gangster Al Capone served time inside Eastern State Penitentiary. Unlike most prisoners, Capone lived in relative luxury. His cell reportedly contained fine furniture, rugs, paintings, and special privileges few others could dream of receiving. But despite the comfort, Capone was terrified. According to prison staff, he became convinced that he was being stalked by the ghost of James Clark, one of the victims murdered during the St. Valentine's Day massacre. Capone claimed Clark's spirit followed him through the prison at night, tormenting him in the darkness while he tried desperately to sleep, and Capone would not be the last person to report strange encounters inside those walls. Eastern State Penitentiary officially closed in 1971 after nearly 142 years of operation. By then, the once revolutionary prison had become overcrowded, deteriorated, and infamous for its brutal history. But closure did not bring silence. If anything, the stories only became darker. Today, visitors and paranormal investigators from around the world travel to the abandoned prison searching for answers. Many leave convinced that something unnatural still lingers inside the crumbling cell blocks. One of the most terrifying encounters came from a locksmith named Gary Johnson. While repairing an old lock inside cell block 4, Johnson suddenly felt an unseen force overpower him. According to his account, he became completely frozen in place, unable to move, unable to scream. Then, all around him, distorted faces appeared to emerge from the walls themselves, twisted expressions filled with agony and rage. Johnson later claimed he saw a massive, shadow-like figure move across the cell block before the force finally released him. He fled the area in absolute panic, and disturbingly, other investigators have reported seeing the exact same dark figure over the years. Some believe the entity could be the spirit of Joseph Taylor, a violent inmate who murdered an overseer inside the prison in 1884. Others think it may be something far older and far more sinister, something created by decades of suffering trapped within those walls. Cell Block 12 is considered one of the most active paranormal hotspots in the prison. Visitors regularly report hearing distant screaming, mocking laughter, whispers, and footsteps echoing through empty corridors. Investigators often rush toward the sounds only to find the hallways completely deserted. In Cell Block 6, shadow figures are said to dart along the walls before vanishing into darkness. Some visitors claim they've felt icy hands brush against their skin. Others describe an overwhelming sense of dread so intense they immediately leave the area. And perhaps the most disturbing reports involve the old guard towers. Late at night, witnesses have described seeing a lone figure standing motionless at the top of the towers, staring silently across the prison grounds. Some believe it's the spirit of a former guard still carrying out his eternal watch over the inmates trapped below. Over the years, the prison has become so infamous that paranormal television shows like Ghost Hunters conducted investigations there. During one investigation, a shadow figure was reportedly captured on camera moving through the prison halls. Equipment failures and unexplained disturbances became common throughout filming. But maybe none of this is surprising. Because Eastern State Penitentiary was never simply a prison. It was a machine built from isolation, fear, and punishment. A place where thousands suffered in silence behind stone walls designed to erase human beings from the world around them. And if enough pain lingers in one place for long enough, maybe it leaves something behind. Something waiting in the darkness of those abandoned halls, something that still refuses to leave. The story ends here, but the terror does not. Join me again. Like, comment, and subscribe if you dare.